The shovel handle was a raw, splintered extension of the pain radiating up his forearm, vibrating with every impact against the shale-hard soil. Dust, the color of old rust and pulverized bone, choked the air, settling in a gritty film on the sweat that had long since stopped cooling him. Elias did not remember his name anymore, only the rhythmic scrape of the iron blade and the dull, persistent ache behind his eyes. He was a machine fueled by fear and meager rations of brackish water, his existence reduced to the next swing, the next breath, the next moment the whip might fall. They were digging a perimeter trench for the main camp, a brutal, pointless effort intended more to break the slaves, will than to provide meaningful defense against the scattered remnants of the militias. Carr, the raider assigned to this section, sat atop a rusted fuel drum, his silhouette massive and indifferent against the searing midday sun. Carr did not believe in rest. He believed in momentum, maintained through casual cruelty. Elias's ribs, cracked 3 days prior when he stumbled hauling a load of scrap metal, screamed with every torsional movement required to heave the spoil over the rapidly growing berm. The air smelled of cheap tobacco smoke and the metallic tongue of dried blood plastered to the back of Elias's neck, souvenirs from a previous correction. He hadn't eaten a full meal in 72 hours, subsisting on half rations of dried synth paste that tasted like oxidized chemicals and remorse. Hope was a liability, a weakness the raiders exploited with surgical precision. Elias had learned to excise it, replacing the void with a cold, clear focus on efficiency. He measured his output not by the depth of the trench, but by the distance between himself and Carr's heavy boot, the interval between the swings of the whip. Survival was micromanagement, breathing shallowly when the dust kicked up, rationing the saliva in his mouth, keeping his eyes fixed on the dirt so as not to meet the bored gaze of the guards who occasionally patrolled the perimeter. The other slaves, 20 broken figures strung along the line, were ghosts already. They moved in silence, their individuality stripped away, replaced by the collective identity of the property. The only sound was the synchronized clank-scrape-thud of the tools, a morbid rhythm section accompanying the slow death of their humanity. He remembered a wife, a small garden, the smell of rain on asphalt, but those memories were fading, dissolving under the constant pressure of the present reality. They were luxuries he could no longer afford to carry. The sun crusted its zenith, burning through the thin fabric of his tunic and scorching the already blistered skin of his shoulders. The heat was not just external. It was internal, a feverish, dehydrating pressure that made concentration a luxury. Elias focused on the small, smooth stone lodged beneath his heel, counting the minutes until the meager, mandated water break. He knew Carr would delay it, just to watch the desperation build, to hear the wheezing coughs become more ragged. The raiders didn't just demand labor. They demanded the absolute surrender of dignity, proving their ownership by controlling the most basic biological needs. Elias stumbled. It was barely a hitch, a momentary lapse where the exhaustion finally overloaded the damaged neural circuitry. The shovel blade caught the edge of the trench, twisting violently out of his grip and clattering against the loose rock. The sound was deafening in the relative silence of the labor line. Carr was moving before the reverberation died. The raider didn't shout. Shouting wasted energy. He simply walked the few paces, his shadow falling over Elias like a suffocating blanket. Elias instinctively braced himself, curling his shoulders inward, protecting the already compromised ribs. Carr's correction was swift, brutal, and entirely impersonal. It wasn't rage. It was maintenance. The heavy, reinforced toe of the boot connected directly with the small of Elias's back, just above the kidney. A flash of white-hot agony erased the dusty landscape. Elias gasped, a sound swallowed instantly by the dry air, and collapsed onto his knees, tasting grit and bile. "Get up, property." Carr's voice was low, flat, and bored. "You waste daylight. 5 extra meters tonight. Dig. The decree was absolute. Elias scrambled, grabbing the shovel, the pain in his back sharpening into a persistent, sickening throb. He knew Carr hadn't hit him hard enough to permanently disable him. That would be inefficient. He had hit him hard enough to remind him that his life was defined by the depth of the hole he dug and the speed at which he dug it. Carr's correction demanded the immediate re-establishment of the rhythm of survival. This correction was not merely physical. It was a psychological reset, a sharp reminder that any deviation from absolute efficiency would be met with swift, escalating agony. Elias forced the shovel into the hard-packed earth, the jarring impact sending a violent, white-hot spike of agony up his spine from the deep, throbbing bruise above his left kidney. The pain was a constant, demanding presence, a malignant focus point. He could not favor the injury. Diminished capacity invited a disabling adjustment, and a disabled slave was a dead slave. Breathing through his teeth, pulling the ragged air deep into his burning lungs, he focused solely on the granular dirt and the precise, minute angle needed to leverage the shovel without twisting his core, a movement that would guarantee collapse. Every muscle fiber from his hamstrings to his shoulders was taut, strained into a posture of unnatural rigidity designed to protect the damaged infrastructure of his body. Carr remained stationary 20 meters distant, a monument of lethal indifference silhouetted against the blinding haze of the mid-morning sun. His presence was a palpable weight, an invisible pressure field forcing Elias to micromanage every calorie of effort, every drop of sweat. Carr was not merely supervising. He was gauging the breaking point, identifying the exact moment when the physical structure would fail and the will would dissolve. The 5 extra meters of excavation was a death sentence delivered in increments, guaranteeing Elias would work past the mandated rest cycle, sacrificing vital repair time and starting the next day deep in exhaustion debt, a deficit that eroded not just muscle, but cognitive function and the immune response. Carr understood that true cruelty lay in the systematic dismantling of resilience, not in sudden, fatal violence. The earth was unforgiving, a perverse reflection of the raiders' authority. They were digging the foundation trench for the raiders' stronghold, a structure designed to be a permanent military-industrial complex, 2 meters deep and 80 centimeters wide. The structure's precise, brutalist engineering confirmed the permanence of their captivity, a testament to the fact that escape was not merely difficult, but structurally impossible. The long dry season had baked the clay and silt into a caliche-laced, refractory hardness, forcing Elias to use the reinforced shovel edge like a crude mattock. He had to fracture the surface in small, agonizing chips before he could scoop the dense, 15-kilogram load onto the spoil pile. The shovel handle was slick with caustic sweat and grit, chafing the raw flesh of his palms, but he dared not loosen his grip. His vision narrowed, the periphery dissolving into a shimmering, heat-induced haze of white noise. Only the black gleam of Carr's polished boots and the sharp, clean edge of his shovel blade remained in focused clarity. The constant, repetitive motion was hypnotic torture, a mantra of suffering that consumed all higher thought. Lift, pivot, throw, drop, strike. This was the syntax of his existence, the only language the body was permitted to speak. The rhythm was the only thing standing between him and the whip. Elias was actively discarding memories of his wife and the life they shared. They were anchors to a reality that demanded emotional energy he could not spare. He practiced a form of self-amputation, severing the nerve pathways to sentiment. Hope was not merely foolish. It was a metabolic drain, requiring oxygen and focus that belonged to the shovel. Guilt, the memory of promises broken, was a luxury reserved for the dead or those about to join them. Survival demanded pure, cold, reptilian focus on the immediate metric, the distance between shovel strikes, the depth achieved in the last 5 minutes. He was a machine optimized for dirt displacement. his consciousness reduced to monitoring his body's internal combustion engine. Ragged, insufficient air intake, a throat as dry as kill-fired brick, and the pervasive metallic tongue of dehydration leaching iron from his blood. Sweat turned instantly to abrasive salt, stinging the open wounds on his shoulders, where the rough fabric of his tunic had rubbed the skin raw. The air clung with the collective, heavy odor of unwashed bodies, stale sweat, ancient dust, and the sharp, undeniable scent of fear, a chemical compound that permeated the site. He risked a quick peripheral glance at Slave 14, a man working the adjacent segment of the trench to his left, a former schoolteacher whose glasses had been long since confiscated, now a scarecrow figure moving with vacant, terrifying efficiency. Shared humanity was the first thing the raiders excised from their labor force. To acknowledge the suffering of the man beside you, to permit a flicker of empathy, risked catastrophic emotional failure that would break the essential cold focus required for survival. They were 20 isolated units of labor, 20 atomized souls bound only by command and the knowledge of the whip's reach and Carr's rifle sight. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the scrape of metal against clay and the ragged, desperate exhalations of men fighting for air. Each slave was an island of isolated torment, focused solely on the brutal necessity of moving the dirt. The sun began its slow, inevitable descent toward the horizon, but the heat intensified, radiating back from the baked earth in blistering waves. The air, now thick with pulverized dust and clay particles, turned Elias's cough into a dry, tearing rasp. He calculated the remaining daylight against the 5 extra meters Carr had imposed. The standard quota was 20 meters of trench. He needed 25. This meant sacrificing the brief, mandated 3-minute water break entirely, risking the severe physiological consequences of dehydration against the certainty of punishment for failure. He chose efficiency over hydration. The calculation was purely utilitarian. A 3-minute rest would not restore enough energy to compensate for the lost digging time. When the shrill, piercing whistle signaled the 3-minute water ration, Elias kept digging, his movements rigid and continuous. The other slaves, driven by instinct, shuffled toward the guarded water drum, their exhaustion momentarily overriding their fear. Elias ignored the searing thirst and the cramping muscles that threatened to seize his calves, using the lull to gain a critical, existential advantage. Every scoop while they rested was an inch of survival earned, a fractional increase in the probability that he would survive the night. Carr noticed immediately. Instead of joining the other guards near the water drum, he moved slowly, deliberately toward Elias, his boots crunching on the spoil pile. "Thirsty, property?" Carr's voice was a low, resonant rumble, laced with mocking curiosity. Elias did not look up, maintaining the mechanical focus on the dirt. "No, overseer," he croaked, projecting a facade of tireless, machine-like dedication. The lie tasted like ash. Carr chuckled, a sound devoid of warmth. "Resourceful. You think saving 5 minutes now will save you 5 meters later." He casually planted his boot deep into the excavation and kicked a large quantity of excavated dirt back into the trench, contaminating the completed work. "That doesn't count, property. Clean it out. And since you missed the mandatory water break to demonstrate your superior diligence." Carr paused, letting the implication sink in. "That means you don't get the water later either. Efficiency," he concluded, his voice hardening, "is rewarded with maximum work capacity." The calculated, clinical cruelty of the decree hit Elias harder than any physical blow. Carr had moved the goalposts not to enforce a rule, but specifically to maximize suffering and guarantee Elias's failure. He had forfeited his only chance for moisture, guaranteeing severe dehydration that would erode strength, clarity, and the ability to fight off the night fever. Elias's throat constricted. Every breath felt like inhaling dry sandpaper. He swallowed the rising bile and grit, scraping out the contaminated dirt. The dry earth accelerated the desiccation, pulling moisture from his skin and lungs. The pain in his back was no longer a spike, but a constant, heavy throb, a systemic ache. He shifted his stance, adopting a crouched, animalistic posture, relying on the tremendous strength of his legs and shoulders to compensate for the damaged core. Carr had engineered a situation designed to test the absolute, final limits of human endurance. As the sun dipped lower, casting long, distorted shadows across the site, the pace became desperate. Exhaustion reached critical mass. His numb, calloused hands moved independently of conscious thought, fueled now only by instinct, residual adrenaline, and the deep, abiding fear of the night punishment. The air turned a heavy, bruised violet, signaling the rapid approach of inspection time. He noted Slave 14's wet, rattling cough, calculating coldly that the man had perhaps weeks before being deemed inefficient and disposed of. Elias had to be perfect. He had to surpass the impossible quota. The guards began shouting, their voices hoarse, urging a final, frantic acceleration. Inspection was the true terror, the moment of ultimate accountability. Carr would measure the depth and width with a cold, unforgiving precision. If the trench was shallow by even a centimeter, punishment would be severe, perhaps fatal. Elias drove himself forward, pushing through the barrier of pain. Pain was no longer localized. It was systemic, a high-pitched buzzing white noise filling his skull. He was no longer digging a trench. He was burying the man he used to be, interring his past life inch by agonizing inch. The shovel connected with a large, deeply buried stone, a granite obstruction that had resisted the forces of geology for millennia. The impact jolted his arms violently, sending excruciating spasms through his bruised back that momentarily stole his breath and clarity. He used the flat edge to chip around the obstruction, a delicate, surgical task he was losing the ability to execute as the shadows merged into an oppressive blanket of deep twilight. 8 meters remained of his 25. He tasted blood, a metallic, sharp reminder of the body's disintegration under duress. He pushed past the stone, the scraping metal desperate and loud in the deepening gloom. He had to finish before Carr returned for the final tally. Failure was not just punishment. It was the loss of the ability to continue the meaningless, brutal fight for survival. He drove the shovel down, focusing on the brutal necessity of moving the earth. One last time. Dig. The granite obstruction, a geological anchor fused into the bedrock, was an immovable mass. Every strike against it resonated up his spine, a jolt of agony that buckled his knees and made his vision swim. His mouth was a desert, his tongue thick, useless. Lack of moisture meant muscles were tearing, fibers snapping under the load, compounded by the furnace of the fever building rapidly. He hyperventilated, dragging thin, dusty air across a throat raw from grit and the acrid metallic tang of his own blood, a visceral reminder of his body's disintegration. The world narrowed to the 8 meters remaining, each centimeter demanding a proportional measure of his depleting life force. He worked the shovel like a crude scalpel, using the worn steel edge to scrape away the compacted, clay-heavy dirt, searching for a purchase point that did not jar the granite. Moving the obstruction was impossible. The intrusion was too deep. He could only bypass it, a necessity that would cost critical depth and time, a fatal compromise forced by geology. The pain in his lower back was no longer an injury signal, but the baseline state of existence. A heavy pressure centered on his lumbar spine. His legs began to tremble uncontrollably, a violent, involuntary shaking signaling severe electrolyte imbalance. He tasted the grit of the desiccated earth, his mind a strained wire taut between the immediate task and the crushing certainty of Carr's return. The mechanical rhythm of the work lift and swing, was all that prevented his collapse, dissolving meaning into pure physical endurance. The violet light of the dying bay deepened into bruised indigo. The heavy, cooling air pressed down on his exhausted frame. He abandoned the futile attempt to pry the granite free, a waste of energy he could not spare. Survival dictated a compromise. He dug shallower around the obstruction, sacrificing mandated technical depth for speed. This strategic failure was a calculated, desperate gamble that Carr, inspecting in the failing light, might miss the localized deviation, a gamble Elias knew. With sickening certainty, he would lose, but one that bought him the final 25 meters. He was trading integrity for mere distance. He pushed past the massive stone, the scraping metal of the shovel loud in the deepening gloom, covering the exposed earth quickly. The shovel became an extension of the man, driven by sheer, panicked will. 8 meters evaporated into a frantic, agonizing blur, fueled by the last burning reserves of muscle energy that were consuming the body itself. His vision tunneled sharply, the periphery dissolving into static, forcing focus onto the dark earth beneath his arms. He heard the ragged, wet breaths of the other slaves, a collective moan that faded into silence whenever a patrolling guard moved near. The granite obstruction was behind him, its bulk a silent indictment of time and depth sacrificed. His diaphragm spasmed violently, a painful reminder that the body was running on fumes, tearing itself apart in the final effort. The rhythmic, grating sound of steel against stone and dirt was the only reality, driving him into the final stretch. He drove the shovel down one last time, forcing the steel edge to bite deep into the final centimeter of the 25th meter. The sound scraped loud and definitive. Finished. The word echoed internally, hollow and temporary. He dropped the tool. It clattered against the dry earth, the sound echoing unnaturally loud in the profound silence that fell over the worksite. All 50 slaves had reached the critical point, the end of labor, the beginning of judgment. They stood, frozen, silhouettes stark against the indigo horizon, waiting for Carr. The air was heavy with dust, sweat, and collective dread. Elias straightened slowly, the systemic ache radiating from his lower back, forcing a shallow, careful breath. Exhaustion threatened to pull him down, but the instinct for survival kept his knees locked. Then came the sound, the measured, rhythmic thump-thump of reinforced boots on the compacted perimeter road. Carr emerged from the gloom near the supply depot, a figure of rigid authority silhouetted against the distant processing fires. He carried the measuring rod, a length of polished, obsidian metal that seemed designed to absorb all light, rendering it utterly black and menacing. He moved directly toward Elias's section, ignoring the others, a chilling signal of targeted failure. Carr stopped at the start point of the trench. Without looking at Elias, he inserted the rod. The sharp, mechanical click confirmed the mandated depth. He moved step by step, his movements economical, devoid of emotion. Each successful click was a false reprieve, stretching the tension to breaking point. Elias's heart hammered against his ribs, the frantic rhythm drowning out the silence of the watching slaves. Carr reached the point of compromise. His heavy boots scuffed the surface of the hastily covered earth. He paused, his analytical focus settling instantly on the minute deviation in the earth's profile, the subtle slope where depth had been abandoned. He knelt, not in curiosity, but in confirmation. His gloved fingers traced the line, identifying the shallow bypass. The measuring rod dropped, sinking 19 centimeters instead of the required 22. 3 centimeters. 3 centimeters sealed Elias's fate. Carr stood, turning to Elias for the first time. His eyes, cold and dark, held only the certainty of consequence. You failed the technical requirement, Slave 81. You prioritized distance over integrity. A predictable human error driven by desperation. His voice was low, perfectly controlled. The quota is the minimum standard. The technical specification is the law that guarantees your continued existence. Elias tried to articulate the impossibility of the granite, but the extreme dryness in his throat turned the plea into a choked, rasping sound that carried no argument. Carr merely tilted his head in a slow, deliberate gesture of dismissal. He signaled the nearest guard, a hulking figure known as the Butcher, with an imperceptible nod. The Butcher moved with terrifying speed, the heavy polymer stock of his rifle swinging low. Elias lacked the milliseconds for evasion. His exhausted body was too slow. The impact struck his temple, a blinding, concussive force that shattered his equilibrium. His ears rang violently, a high-pitched whine that obliterated all sound. He collapsed instantly, hitting the dry earth with a dead-weight thud that drove the last of the air from his lungs. He tried desperately to roll, but the Butcher's heavy, steel-toed boot slammed down onto the small of his back, precisely over his spine. The agony was instantaneous, absolute, a searing bolt of fire. A guttural animal cry tore from his throat, instantly stifled as Carr's polished boot followed, planting itself heavily on the back of Elias's neck, crushing his face into the cold dirt. The weight was immense, calculated, pressing down on his trachea, forcing the residual air from his lungs. He was choking on the gritty, suffocating earth filling his nostrils and mouth. He clawed weakly at the ground, unable to find leverage against Carr's crushing weight. Carr leaned down, his voice a low, chilling murmur beside Elias's ringing ear. "You chose dehydration, 81. You chose the fever. I will not let you die easily or quickly from neglect." The pressure on his neck increased, an agonizing suffocation. "The night cure begins now. I will guarantee you survive the fever, only so you can feel the pain of the morning inspection." The Butcher, acting on a silent command, shifted his stance. A sharp, searing pain exploded in Elias's thigh as the guard delivered a targeted kick designed to induce a deep, debilitating cramp that seized the entire limb, rendering it acutely painful for hours. The pain was immediate, crippling, a localized fire, adding a horrific dimension to the systemic ache. Elias gasped, inhaling more dirt, the filth burning his lungs. He was pinned, broken, drowning in the darkness and the cold, the temperature promising the brutal descent into the night fever, a fever he was guaranteed to endure, fully conscious, under Carr's punishing eye. The systemic ache was now a symphony of localized torture. Carr was ready to harvest the suffering he had cultivated. The suffocating pressure of Carr's boot on his neck was a calculated instrument of control, not merely pain. It was heavy enough to occlude the carotid artery partially, inducing a dizzying hypoxia that blended seamlessly with the existing fever and dehydration. The gritty earth was a rasping texture against his tongue, his face vibrating slightly with the residual energy of the rifle stock impact. The high-pitched whine in his ears, initially overwhelming, began to modulate into a steady, agonizing frequency, the sound of damaged nerves protesting the violence. He could hear Carr breathing above him, the sound impossibly calm, a counterpoint to the desperate, shallow attempts Elias made to draw air past the compressed cartilage of his throat. "You believe technical specifications are arbitrary obstacles, 81. They are not. They are survival parameters," Carr murmured, the words vibrating through the sole of his boot and into Elias's skull. "The structural integrity of the quarry face determines the safety margin for the next shift. Your failure jeopardizes the resource flow, which is unacceptable. Your personal suffering is merely a necessary corrective measure." The Butcher, standing over the contorted figure, executed the next phase with mechanical precision. He knelt, not to offer aid, but to ensure the targeted pain was maximized. The kick had induced a severe Charlie horse, but the subsequent manipulation of brutal, deep tissue kneading performed with the heel of his boot was designed to tear the muscle fibers minutely, locking the quadriceps into a sustained, excruciating spasm. Elias arched his back involuntarily against the weight of Carr, a silent scream tearing at his lungs. The cramp was a living entity of pain, pulling the muscle taut against the femur, a relentless, localized fire that demanded his entire focus. It was impossible to draw the leg up, impossible to straighten it. It simply seized, a rigid, vibrating rod of pure agony. Carr shifted his weight slightly, easing the pressure just enough to allow a ragged, dirty gasp of air. The pain in your thigh will ensure you are acutely aware of every moment of this night. It will prevent the comfort of unconsciousness. 81. The butcher produced a narrow, flexible tube, a high-flow nasal cannula, and without preamble, shoved the oiled tips deep into Elias's nostrils. The sudden intrusion caused a violent gag reflex, but before he could spit out the dirt, a cold, viscous liquid began to pump directly into his sinus cavity. It was not water. It was a hypertonic saline solution, chilled almost to freezing. The cold shock was instantaneous, searing through the delicate mucosal lining and flooding his system. The chilling fluid, delivered rapidly, induced an immediate systemic shock, fighting the core temperature rise of the impending fever. Elias choked, the liquid burning his throat and sinuses, the metallic, chemical taste overwhelming the dirt. The rapid influx of cold electrolytes caused the muscles in his chest and abdomen to seize in involuntary spasms, fighting the internal temperature drop. This forced rehydration was a violation, an invasive assault on his failing body. Carr was ensuring the fluid bypassed the slow, painful absorption of the digestive tract, forcing the body to cope with a sudden, massive shift in fluid balance and temperature. Dehydration is a slow, painless death, Carr stated, his voice clinical, detached. We cannot afford the loss of capital. We accelerate the process. We force the cure. The pain was now a complex, layered architecture of suffering. The high-frequency ringing in his skull, the paralyzing fire in his thigh, the searing, crushing ache of his spine under the butcher's boot, and now the profound internal shuddering caused by the infusion. His skin, already clammy from fever, erupted in gooseflesh as the cold fluid worked its way through his system. His body was fighting itself, the fever driving the core temperature up, the mandated cure forcing it down rapidly. The resulting agony was the physiological equivalent of tearing his tissues apart. The butcher maintained the infusion for a calculated 30 seconds, the duration precisely measured to prevent cardiac arrest while ensuring maximum systemic shock. When the tube was yanked out, the residual fluid streamed down Elias's face, mixing with the sweat and the dust. The guard then retrieved a small, sterile pack, opening it with a sharp tear. He selected a large bore needle, the metallic gleam catching the faint moonlight filtering through the haze. This was not for infusion. This was for stabilization. He found the median cubital vein in Elias's arm, which was splayed uselessly in the dirt. The insertion was swift and brutal, the needle jamming into the vein wall before settling. The butcher attached a smaller, clear tube and allowed a few drops of dark, sluggish blood to flow into a collection vial before sealing it. Blood viscosity is unacceptable, Carr noted, observing the sample critically. The fluid ratio is too low. We have corrected the immediate danger of renal failure. 81. You will urinate soon. That will be the confirmation of your successful rehydration. Do not attempt to hold it. The butcher finally lifted his heavy boot from Elias's spine, a small mercy that allowed Elias to draw a deeper, rattling breath. But the relief was fleeting. Carr's boot remained fixed on his neck, pinning his head immovably to the ground. The spinal injury, though not fatal, was severe enough that movement was unthinkable. The muscle fibers protested every shift, every shallow breath. The localized cramp in his thigh, however, was now the dominant sensory input, a relentless, throbbing pulse of absolute agony that overshadowed the lesser pains. Carr signaled the butcher, who silently retrieved a thin, dark blanket, a thermal foil designed to prevent rapid heat loss, but also to intensify the internal heat generated by the fever. He draped it over Elias's shuddering body, tucking the edges tightly around his torso and legs, effectively trapping him in a pressurized furnace. "We ensure you metabolize the electrolytes, 81. We ensure the fever does not break prematurely," Carr explained, his voice taking on the tone of a lecturer addressing a particularly dull student. "You are currently entering the peak phase of pyrexia. The pain you feel now is the direct result of cellular inflammation and systemic shock. You will find that the constant, localized pain in your thigh is an excellent anchor. It prevents the delirium of the fever from taking hold fully." The guard departed, his heavy boots crunching softly on the dry earth, leaving Elias alone with Carr. The overseer finally lifted his boot from Elias's neck, but only to place his weight directly on Elias's shoulder blade, pressing him flat against the cold ground. This position allowed Elias to turn his head fractionally, spitting out a mouthful of dirt and metallic-tasting bile. He looked up at Carr, seeing the man silhouetted against the weak starlight. Carr was not watching the surrounding perimeter. He was watching Elias, studying the minute tremors running through his body beneath the thermal blanket. Elias could feel the fever intensifying, the heat trapped by the foil beginning to radiate back onto his skin. The cold infusion had momentarily shocked his system, but the underlying infection and dehydration were now roaring back, fueled by the forced hydration. The metallic tang of the hypersaline solution lingered, and coupled with the ringing in his ears, it created a profound sensory disorientation. He was intensely aware of the granite dust coating his tongue, the specific fine grit of the material he had failed to extract correctly. It tasted of failure and consequence. Elias tried to focus on the pain in his thigh, attempting to use it, as Carr had suggested, an anchor to consciousness. But the pain was too absolute, too demanding. It consumed thought, reducing his existence to a rhythmic, pulsing throb of agony that drowned out all attempts at rational resistance. He realized with horrifying clarity that Carr's methodology was flawless. He had taken the body's natural defense mechanisms, fever, dehydration, unconsciousness, and weaponized the cure, guaranteeing a prolonged, conscious agony. The night stretched before him, an infinite expanse of cold ground and trapped heat. The promise of the morning inspection, when Carr would meticulously examine the structural integrity of his body and the residual effects of the night cure, was the only thing standing between him and the oblivion his exhausted body craved. He was a piece of failing machinery, forcibly maintained, lubricated only by pain, under the precise, unblinking surveillance of his technician. The systemic ache of exhaustion had been replaced by a precise, surgical torture, designed not to kill, but to teach the ultimate lesson in technical obedience. He closed his eyes, instantly finding the darkness filled with the pulsing, high-pitched whine of his concussion and the ceaseless burning fire of the artificial cramp. He was trapped, agonizingly alive, waiting for the dawn that would bring not relief, but the next stage of Carr's calculated brutality. Carr remained standing, silent, a monolith of unforgiving consequence, ensuring every breath Elias took was a testament to his failure. The pressure on his shoulder blade was a constant, dull counterpoint to the sharp combustion raging within his core. The cheap foil blanket, designed to prevent hypothermia, now acted as an oven, accelerating the systemic fever Carr was determined to keep conscious. Elias's skin felt simultaneously slick with sweat beneath the synthetic material and dry on his exposed face, a miserable paradox of internal overheating and critical dehydration. Every breath was shallow, tasting of the dry, mineral-rich air and the corrosive salinity of the forced infusion. The hypersaline had succeeded in its primary goal, raising his blood pressure just enough to keep his heart hammering against his ribs, preventing the blissful descent into hypotensive shock that might have offered temporary respite or permanent oblivion. But this enforced vitality came at a catastrophic cost. The increased fluid pressure amplified the nerve signals, turning the rhythmic throb in his fractured thigh from a localized injury into a system-wide, electrical fire that overloaded his sensory processing. He tried again to tether his mind to the pain, to use it as the anchor Carr intended, but the signal was too distorted, too loud. It wasn't an anchor. It was a siren, screaming incoherence that shattered rational thought. The pain consumed the present, destroying the past and rendering the future an impossibility. He was trapped within a feedback loop of agony, where the cure intensified the suffering, and the suffering prevented the unconsciousness that might have healed him. The metallic tang of the saline solution leached into his saliva, mixing with the fine, abrasive grit of the granite dust, coating his tongue and throat, the unforgiving texture of the material he had failed to process correctly. This taste was a constant, chemical reminder of his biological contamination and the mechanical error that had brought him to this point. It was the taste of the pit, the bitter flavor of immediate consequence. Carr remained motionless, his silhouette against the faint glow of the distant refinery stacks a study in uncompromising vigilance. He was calculating. Carr's eyes, even in the darkness, seemed to pierce the thermal wrap, reading the subtle language of systemic failure, the rate of capillary refill, the involuntary clenching of the jaw, the shallow, rapid cadence of his respiration. Every minute movement, every tremor of exhaustion, was logged and cross-referenced against the intended psychological impact. Carr was not interested in comfort or mercy. He was interested only in the optimal stress threshold necessary to reset Elias's operational parameters. This silent surveillance was far more terrifying than any physical blow. The initial violence had been transactional cost for failure. This observation was diagnostic. He was not being punished, he was being maintained. The shame of his structural failure was secondary to the mechanical inconvenience of his body's collapse. He was an asset, and Carr was performing preventative maintenance, designed to inflict maximal psychological compliance by denying the body its natural right to shut down. The concussion's whine intensified, evolving from a high-pitched ring to a pulsating drone, modulating sickeningly with his heartbeat. The world began to warp at the edges, the faint starlight fracturing into icy shards of light. The shadows thrown by Carr's boots stretched and contracted, mimicking the deliberate movement of predators circling a downed meal. The air itself seemed thick with static, humming with the unprocessed energy of his neurological overload. He felt the edges of his vision blurring, not from physical weakness, but from the sheer volume of sensory input his brain was trying to filter. Elias fought the urge to close his eyes, knowing that the internal landscape of his fevered mind was now infinitely more threatening than the external reality. When he did blink, the darkness was not empty. It was filled with the rhythmic, blinding flash of the pain signal in his thigh, a strobe light of biological distress. He attempted to count the seconds, to impose structure on the infinite night, but the counting dissolved instantly into meaningless syllables, swallowed by the fever's rising tide. He focused instead on the cold air entering his nostrils, trying to draw the chill deep into his lungs to counteract the furnace in his core. The effort was futile. His body was a closed system, rapidly overheating, and the pain was the pressure relief valve, constantly demanding attention. He remembered, briefly, a time before the pit, a time when pain was a warning signal. That memory was thin and brittle, snapping under the immediate, overwhelming weight of the present agony. He was no longer Elias. He was merely the vessel of the injury, defined solely by the continuous systemic failure Carr was preventing from achieving terminal velocity. The realization struck him with the clarity of ice water. Carr's lesson was not retribution. It was technical ownership. He was teaching Elias that his suffering was not his own, that even the mechanism of his biological breakdown belonged entirely to the raiders. The pain was not a consequence of failing the task. It was the mechanism of learning the absolute necessity of technical obedience. The body could break, but the will must be preserved and directed toward the next mandated output. Elias understood now that the fear of death, which he had always relied upon as a primal motivator for survival, had been successfully inverted, he didn't fear dying. He feared surviving this night, only to face Carr's calculated inspection in the morning, the moment Carr would confirm the asset was sufficiently chastened and ready for redeployment. This was the ultimate control, the denial of self-determination, even in the face of absolute physical collapse. His very agony was a controlled variable in Carr's brutal equation. The intense throbbing in his leg became the metronome of his captivity, a brutal manifestation of the contract he had signed in blood and dust. He was a machine that required recalibration, and Carr was the engineer who refused to turn off the power, regardless of how loudly the gears screamed in protest. The granite dust settled heavier in his throat, a dry, inescapable reminder of the geology that had dictated his fate and the precise nature of his technical failure. The irony was a jagged pill he was forced to swallow. The material he had failed to extract efficiently was now physically choking him, a particulate judgment on his lack of compliance. He was a prisoner of consciousness, forcibly dragged back from delirium every time the fever threatened to grant him refuge. The hypersaline was working too well, maintaining a cruel equilibrium between life and agony. He could feel the fine tremors running through his muscles, the involuntary spasms of deep fatigue struggling against the chemical stimulant. He focused on the grinding sensation of the bone fragments in his thigh, trying to compartmentalize the pain, to reduce it back to a physical injury, rather than the metaphysical horror it had become. He attempted to isolate the damage, to build mental walls around the epicenter of the trauma, but the electrical feedback loop was too strong. Carr had successfully weaponized the localized trauma, turning it into a systemic override that prevented mental retreat. Every attempt at abstraction failed, slamming him back into the immediate reality of his compromised physiology. Hours bled into one another, marked only by the increasing difficulty of drawing a full breath and the subtle shift in the temperature of the ground as the desert night deepened its chill. Carr never moved. He remained the fixed point in a swirling vortex of pain and fevered hallucination. Elias saw the faint outline of stars, distorted by the atmospheric haze of the industrial complex, and imagined them as tiny drill bits, slowly grinding away at the brittle edges of his sanity. The constant, low-frequency pressure of Carr's presence pressed down on him, a non-physical weight that mirrored the physical pressure on his shoulder blade. The sensory deprivation of the long, silent watch amplified the internal chaos. The only sounds were the high-frequency whine of his concussion and the thick, wet sound of his own labored breathing. He tried to mentally catalog the components of his suffering: the blinding heat of the fever, the crushing pressure on his shoulder, a ceaseless electrical fire in his leg, and the profound, bone-deep exhaustion that was the foundation of all the rest. He realized that this catalog was the only thing Carr had left him, the ability to meticulously observe his own destruction. This observation was the final, brutal requirement of technical obedience. He lay there, a conscious casualty of forced survival, waiting for the first brutal rays of dawn to illuminate the precise extent of his submission. The promise of the morning inspection, when Carr would assess the success of his night-long torture, was the only thing preventing the final desperate surrender to the darkness. He had to be conscious, he had to be responsive, and he had to be ready to confirm the lesson. Compliance is mandatory, and suffering is merely a tool for maintenance. Carr's shadow lengthened slightly as the distant light of a perimeter vehicle swept the horizon, a momentary flash that signaled the inevitable approach of the next stage of his calculated brutality. The pain anchored him, not to sanity, but to the inescapable reality of his servitude. The hypersaline solution, pumped hours prior, was a cold, necessary poison. It maintained high osmotic pressure, fighting systemic shock and cellular collapse, but created an unbearable tightness in his chest and a metallic, acrid taste. This taste was the signature of systemic overload, the chemical residue of his body's desperate attempt to reject the mandated intervention. The chemical tang was sharp, like rusted iron and spent battery acid, burning the back of his throat with every shallow inhalation. His heart hammered, rapid and shallow, driven by the chemical whip lashing his adrenal glands. This constant flood of cortisol and adrenaline was an engineered state of perpetual flight response, designed to bypass natural limits of exhaustion and pain tolerance. The solution forced dangerously high blood pressure, ensuring oxygen delivery remained just adequate enough for minimal cognitive function, but not sufficient for rest or repair. He felt the ceaseless, vibrating hum of his own biology being pushed past the breaking point, a terrifying equilibrium maintained by pure force of chemistry. Tremors oscillated between the body's deep biological imperative to shut down and the chemical mandate to stay violently active. These muscular spasms signaled the exhaustion of electrolyte reserves, a chaotic neurological revolt against the enforced stability. His diaphragm strained, muscles burning with lactic acid buildup that compromised circulation struggled to clear. Every breath was a shallow, painful negotiation with failing physiology, a transaction where the cost was always increasing. He was a machine on emergency override, redlining at catastrophic failure, maintained solely by Carr's precise pharmacopoeia. The system was designed to harvest his remaining physical capacity, pushing him past exhaustion into a realm where pain was the only remaining sensory input. The chemicals didn't mask the pain. They simply prevented the pain from achieving its biological objective, forcing shutdown. They transformed agony from a warning signal into a constant, non-negotiable state of being, proving that consciousness could persist efficiently within absolute suffering. He focused on the external world, anchoring against the internal storm. The desert air, now a brace of ice, amplified the fever cycling through him. Settled dust, a fine grit, coated his lips, dry and cracked from dehydration. He smelled stale, hot engine oil mixing nauseatingly with the coppery tongue of his own drying blood, crusted over the abrasions on his face and neck. The air was thick with the scent of ozone and heated metal, the exhaust residue of the industrial complex operating just beyond the dunes. He focused intensely on the weight of the boot, the geometry of the pressure point. Carr used the flat of the sole, distributing the load to avoid crushing the scapula or fracturing the ribs, maximizing the deep, radiating ache seizing the nerve bundles beneath the clavicle. It was professional cruelty refined to a technical specification. Maximum pain applied without structural damage that would compromise future labor capacity. The pressure was a constant, non-negotiable stream of information. You are owned. You are static. You are monitored. The specific angle of the weight confirmed that the objective was not injury, but the precise surgical occupation of his nervous system. The long silence stretched his psychological endurance. His mind recycled the trauma, the flash of impact, the sickening snap of the femur yielding. Carr's detached professional satisfaction as he administered the first dose of saline. Pain was specialized instruction. This night was a proof of concept for compliance under chemically enforced stress. He was the subject, the data point in an experiment proving that the will could be subjugated through pharmacology. He had to absorb the punishment and remain functionally responsive. The ability to articulate his operational status was the metric of success. Failure meant termination. Survival meant accepting his role as an engineered tool. Compliance demanded the complete surrender of internal narrative, the silencing of the self that wished to resist or simply cease existing. His identity was reduced to his capacity for endurance. He began the mental exercise, cataloging the damage to quantify the suffering. Leg, shattered femur, compound fracture, constant high-frequency pain, a white noise of agony vibrating through his skeleton. Immobilization was impossible, the jagged edges of bone scraping with every involuntary twitch. Head, concussion, tinnitus, visual distortion, dull ache, the world swimming slightly at the edges of his vision. Cognitive function degraded, but chemically maintained at minimal awareness, sufficient only for monitoring and reporting. Shoulder, focused pressure trauma. Deep nerve pain, inhibiting movement, anchoring the pain to his core. A constant, dull throb that overshadowed all other localized injuries. System, hypersaline overdrive, fever, dehydration, profound exhaustion. Circulatory system strained, pushing against the mandated chemical ceiling. His body was a detailed ledger of structural failure and chemical compensation. This meticulous accounting was his ultimate act of submission. By detailing his destruction, he proved to Carr that cognitive processes remained intact. The training had succeeded. The low-grade tinnitus masked the desert silence, an electronic whine replacing the natural quiet. The temperature dropped to the pre-dawn low, a biting cold that chilled the blood, sinking deep into the porous bone of his injured leg. He shifted infinitesimally, a twitch of the wrist, seeking relief, a movement imperceptible to the untrained eye. Carr's boot instantly adjusted, increasing the pressure fractionally, signaling the impossibility of unauthorized movement. Carr was not sleeping. He was a static monument to absolute authority, a perfect counterweight to Elias's internal chaos. He derived satisfaction from the demonstration of effortless control. The pressure was the dialect of command, a non-verbal contract of ownership, executed through kinetic force, a constant reminder of the hierarchy of power. As the sun neared the horizon, darkness thinned to a bruised violet. The subtle shift in light brought renewed anxiety. Night had been a static buffer, a period of monitored stasis. Dawn meant inspection, assessment, and the resumption of high-intensity labor. New sounds emerged, the distant thump-thump of industrial pumps restarting, drawing brine from the deep aquifer. The low, grinding growl of heavy machinery warming up, the sound vibrating through the compacted earth, and the abrasive crunch of a patrol vehicle approaching, tires spitting sand. These were the mechanical heartbeat of the operation, signaling the end of rest and the immediate resumption of profitable exploitation. Every gear change, every hydraulic hiss, was a countdown to renewed suffering. He forced his eyes open. Carr's shadow shrank and sharpened as the light rose, transforming from a monolithic threat into a harbinger of calculated, immediate violence. The hypersaline caused sharp, involuntary muscle cramps, deep, seizing spasms that threatened to tear his compromised muscles. He bit down hard on the inside of his cheek, using the localized, acute pain to mask the systemic groan and the involuntary tremor of failure. Carr was listening for the uncontrolled expression of agony that signaled the breakdown of technical discipline. He maintained the facade of inert compliance. The struggle for silence demanded more energy than the fight against the pain itself, a supreme act of internal censorship. He ran a mental diagnostic. Left arm functional but weak, capable of minimal grip. Right arm pinned, circulation compromised, pins and needles fighting the deep ache. Left leg shattered and non-functional, a dead weight. Right leg strained, but capable of minor pivoting if necessary. He calculated his remaining functional capacity at 20%, dedicated entirely to processing and responding to Carr's command. Deviation from protocol meant resistance, and resistance was not an option. The sun crusted the horizon in a brutal explosion of orange and white light, replacing shadows with unforgiving clarity. The dry heat returned instantly, accelerating the dehydration. The deep, throbbing heat radiating from his fractured leg spiked with the rising temperature, fueling the systemic fever. Carr finally moved. The boot lifted off his shoulder with agonizing slowness, the leather peeling away. The sudden release of pressure was a sickening lurch, replaced instantly by profound nausea as his body attempted to recalibrate. Blood rushed back into the compressed tissue, a painful tingling flood of sensation. Nerve endings screamed their sudden reactivation, demanding immediate attention. Carr stood up, stretching his massive frame, indifferent to the suffering he had just inflicted and maintained. Elias locked his eyes onto Carr's boots, refusing the gaze a challenge he could not afford to offer, a small internal gesture of self-preservation. "Report." Carr's voice was a low, gravelly monotone, devoid of inflection. It was a command requiring technical confirmation of the night's conditioning, demanding proof of the successful chemical subjugation. Elias forced the words out, his throat raw and dry, tasting of dust and salt. Status: operational parameters maintained. Compliance confirmed. Damage assessment: femur compromised, compound fracture. Systemic stability maintained by chemical intervention. Cognitive function at minimum required threshold. Awaiting deployment orders. The words were flat, robotic, the required language of obedience, stripped of any personal inflection or plea. Carr stepped closer, nudging the broken leg gently with his boot toe, a testing movement that sent blinding agony up Elias's spine, a flash of white-hot shock. Elias did not flinch, held his breath until the pain subsided, focusing only on the texture of the boot leather and the rough weave of the desert sand beneath it. "Good," Carr stated, the word carrying the weight of final judgment. "You learned the lesson, slave. Your pain is a resource, and you managed its expenditure efficiently." Carr adjusted the hypersaline valve on the IV line, increasing the flow, pushing Elias further into chemical overdrive, ensuring he remained violently alert. "You will be moved to the processing center immediately. You will not slow the crew. You will not fail," Carr commanded. "A fracture is a liability for transit. It will be temporarily stabilized for transport. You will not scream. If you scream, I will ensure the stabilization is permanent in the most literal sense." Elias understood, a crude field setting without anesthesia, relying solely on his chemically enforced consciousness to absorb the sensory shock. He prepared for the grinding sound of bone fragments shifting, the absolute requirement of technical silence, the necessity of absorbing the violence internally. His duty was to absorb the shock without compromising efficiency. He was ready to be broken again. Carr did not move far. He knelt, his shadow falling across Elias's chest, blocking the immediate glare of the rising sun. From a pouch at his belt, he retrieved a coil of heavy-gauge wire, 2 lengths of scavenged, pitted rebar, and a roll of treated, stiffened canvas materials designed for brute force stability, not sterile medical intervention. The air was already shimmering with heat, and the fine desert dust immediately clung to the oily surface of the canvas. Elias watched the preparations with a detached, clinical focus, his mind operating in a pressurized vacuum. The chemical cocktail roaring through his veins ensured that every sensory input was magnified. Yet the central processing unit, his consciousness, was mandated to treat the pain not as suffering, but as a technical variable to be managed. Carr grabbed the boot of Elias's broken leg, the heavy leather slick with dried sweat and blood. He did not ask for cooperation. He expected submission. The compound fracture was visible through the torn fabric of the trousers. The skin stretched taut and discolored, the distal segment clearly misaligned. Carr's movements were economical, lacking any hesitation that might imply compassion. He positioned the 2 lengths of rebar along the lateral and medial sides of the thigh, extending them well past the knee and hip to provide maximum mechanical leverage. "Traction," Carr stated, the word a warning. He placed his massive boot firmly on Elias's pelvis, using his own weight as the counter-traction anchor. With a sudden, explosive pull, Carr exerted immense force on the lower leg, attempting to draw the bone shaft into alignment. The sound was the worst component. It was not a clean snap, but a sickening, wet crunch, the grinding friction of jagged bone ends scraping against each other and tearing through surrounding muscle fascia. A blinding, white-hot sheet of agony ripped through Elias's perception, overriding the chemical dampeners for a critical microsecond. His entire body seized in a full-system spasm, his back arching off the scorching sand. The pain was absolute, a violation of the nervous system's core integrity. He did not scream. He could not. The mandate was technical silence. Instead, a guttural, choked sound escaped, a low, animalistic expulsion of breath trapped deep in his diaphragm. His vision narrowed to a tunnel, the world dissolving into a violent red haze. But the chemical clarity fought back instantly. The hypersaline forced his heart rate to astronomical levels, flooding his system with enough adrenaline to counteract the systemic shock. He forced his focus back to the texture of the sand, the smell of Carr's stale sweat, the operational requirement of the moment. Insufficient alignment, Carr noted, analyzing the position with cold, professional detachment. He released the traction momentarily, allowing the fragments to settle with a dull, sickening thud before applying the force again, this time twisting the lower leg slightly to correct the rotation. The second pull was worse. Elias felt the bone ends lock into a crude, temporary alignment, a sensation, a deep, structural violation that resonated through his entire skeleton. Sweat poured from him instantly, soaking the dust beneath his head. His jaw muscles locked so tightly his teeth ground together, a high-pitched, involuntary noise that Carr ignored. Acceptable, Carr judged. The alignment was crude, designed only to prevent further internal damage during transit, not for healing. Carr immediately began the immobilization process. He wrapped the stiff canvas tightly around the rebar and the injured limb, ensuring the splints were cinched down with brutal force. The heavy gauge wire followed, twisted taut with pliers, biting into the canvas and the flesh beneath, creating tourniquet-like pressure points above and below the fracture site. Each twist of the wire sent a fresh wave of localized, crushing pain. The pressure was so intense, it began to cut off circulation to the lower leg. A deliberate trade-off. Stability at the cost of profound ischemia. Elias's operational status remained green. He cataloged the new pain profile. A deep, throbbing ache overlaid by the sharp, restrictive bite of the wire, and the systemic fever spiking again due to the internal trauma and shock. He monitored his breathing, slowing the shallow, rapid gasps to conserve oxygen and maintain the facade of composure. Carr finished securing the final wire loop, testing the stability with a rough shove. The leg remained rigid, immobile, a heavy, inert anchor. "You managed the expenditure," Carr observed, standing up and towering over Elias. "You proved that the fear of permanent silence is a greater motivator than the biological imperative to vocalize pain. The fracture is now stable for transport. It is a dead weight, slave. You will carry it." Carr kicked a small rusted canteen toward Elias. "Hydrate. You have 60 seconds before the crew moves out. You will be placed on a transport sled, but you will assist with propulsion and maintain continuous security watch. Your operational efficiency must remain 100%. Elias reached for the canteen, the metal hot enough to sear his fingers. The water was foul, metallic, but the hypersaline had dehydrated him to a dangerous degree, and he drank deeply, the liquid barely touching the parched membranes of his throat. The 60 seconds evaporated instantly. The sound of heavy vehicle engines, diesel, and scavenged jet fuel rumbled into the clearing. The processing center crew, a collection of hardened, silent raiders, began their final preparations. A crude, low-slung metal sled, built from scavenged vehicle plating and equipped with solid rubber wheels, was dragged forward. Two raiders, their faces masked by heavy dust goggles and scarves, approached Elias. They handled him like cargo, hoisting him roughly onto the sled. The movement jarred the newly set fracture, and the world tilted violently. But Elias maintained his silence, focusing on the rivet patterns on the sled's floor. Carr secured a heavy chain from the sled's frame to a thick leather harness around Elias's chest. The chain was short, restricting movement, but ensuring he remained tethered to the transport, unable to fall behind. "You are now part of the logistical chain, slave," Carr announced, attaching a small, blinking transponder to the harness. If you slow the pace, the sled will not stop. It will drag you until the friction removes the problem. Do not test the tensile strength of the chain. The first vehicle, a massive armored transport truck, roared to life, its engine shaking the ground. The raider crew began mounting the surrounding security vehicles. Elias, lying prone on the sled, his broken leg immobilized and throbbing with restricted circulation, felt the immediate pull as the chain tightened. He braced his arms, pushing against the ground with his hands, assisting the initial momentum. The desert landscape blurred into motion. The sun climbed higher, relentless and unforgiving, baking the metal sled beneath him. The journey to the processing center had begun a forced transit across kilometers of rough terrain, where every bump, every rock, and every shift in momentum would translate directly into a fresh spike of agony through the compromised structure of his femur. His only resources were the chemical clarity sustaining him and the absolute, technical requirement of survival through silence. He was a mobile, damaged asset, and the cost of failure was immediate, violent termination. The dust and exhaust fumes immediately choked him, but he focused on the rhythm of the sled's wheels, attempting to synchronize his internal pace with the brutal forward momentum of the convoy. He was moving, and that was the only metric that mattered.